What is history, and is it something that we can even trust?
What is history? It's just a story.
While it might help us to know the world around us, our past civilizations, our family, our culture, and maybe even ourselves a little bit better, can we actually trust what we've been taught? Let me ask you this. When you go to tell a story about your past, do you always tell it in the exact same words, the exact same tone, the exact same inflection, and with the exact same point in mind when you are telling it to your audience? Or does that story evolve based on your expertise at telling that story and how you've paid attention to how certain parts of that story land with your audience? And you've become a better storyteller, so you know how to still tell the truth, but maybe embellish it a little bit or use more engaging or emotional words. We've all grown up hearing about the important battles and conquest and wars in our history about great civilization. But is what we learned in school exact facts of the past? Or could it be potentially embellished based on what you do in your own life when you tell your own history? What is history, and is it something we can even trust? That is something we're going to explore today. Let's watch a little clip from Outlander where she's asking this exact question.
Everybody needs a history.
But how do you know it's true? What if he made it up to make you feel better?
Does it matter?
But that's my point. What is history? It's just a story. It changes depending on who's telling it. Like Paul Revere's, like Bonnie Prince Charlie's, like my parents, like my own. History can't be trusted.
Obviously, I'm not the only person in the world that has ever had these questions. What is history, and can we even trust it? These are actually great keywords that are titling this video so that hopefully other people will find us and start to think about history in this patriarchal lens that I keep on talking about. I'm super excited about these next couple of videos as we dive into what is history, what is myth, and how do they intermingle with each other, because this is really the meat of this season, and understanding how fluid these are, which you will be able to do by the end of this video and the next couple of videos. You will start to see that there might be some room for some change in how we view our history, and thus how we concoct our present and move into the future. A little reminder here, this is number 5 in a series of 13 videos, plus a trailer that gives you some additional information about the foundations of how I am building our mind, our frame of work, in order to help deconstruct patriarchy. There's going to be several seasons. I don't know how far we'll go with this, but make sure you go back and you watch those first 5 videos, the trailer, and then 1 through 4, and in order, because I'm building on concepts from video to video before you watch this. You can still watch this video and get the general concept, but these videos do relate to each other, so it's better to watch them in order. Howdy there, jumping in here on the editing stage again to break this video up, and want to again just reiterate that these videos are really meant to be little bite-sized chunks so you can take them and work with them throughout the week and then be able to build on them the following week as we build this season of Deconstructing Patriarchy, History, and Myth. I am super excited to jump into these next couple of months really of work with you in these bite-sized chunks. Today we're going to really look at what is history, how do we get at it, how do we know we can trust it, or can we? Next week we will get into the other topics that you see in this video, but right now change things up and give you a little teaser of the challenge that really is going to be, you won't be able to answer this if you haven't been working with me from episode 1, or really from the teaser all the way up until episode 4. You don't need to complete this lesson per se to answer this challenge, but it will help. Without further ado, let's give you a little teaser of the challenge today, and then we'll jump into our lesson, and then I'll see you at the end.
As we've seen, of the 4 great earliest civilizations, the culture of the Indus Valley was the very last to be discovered, and it remains by far the most mysterious and ill understood. It's the only one of these for which we cannot yet decipher the writing, and so many fundamental questions persist, even about basic aspects of what was once a flourishing culture.
So in order to understand that patriarchal lens, we first really need to understand how history, as we know it, has come to be from a very high level. Now, this is not going to be a graduate level or even an undergraduate level course, maybe an introductory to that course. I am not a historian. I am not a scholar, but I have done years of research in trying to understand how I can understand, first and foremost, the Bible from a historical perspective as I was coming out out of Christianity and its impact on history. And that's led me into the deeper understanding of this patriarchal lens that I keep talking about, and the book, The Creation of Patriarchy and the Creation of Feminine Consciousness by Gerda Lerner. I decided not to go back to get a master's or a doctorate in any of these fields because I really wanted to have an interdisciplinary look at history from the anthropologists, from the sociologists, from the New Testament biblical scholars, from the New Testament historical scholars. They're different, right? And cognitive memory, cognitive science, all these different disciplines. Really, we can't start to piece together our history in an accurate way unless we're really understanding all of these pieces. From my studies, I'm not sure that this is what scholars are doing. Bart Ehrman, in one of his books that I'm listening to now, Jesus Before the Gospels, he talks about how historians really don't look at some of the cognitive and psychological sciences when they're putting together history. Just a little side note there. Today, in this video, we are going to focus on what is historical method and how that has come about and how we might be able to use that as we're piecing together this patriarchal lens that I'm talking about. We're going to talk about where history, myth, and oral tradition all overlap. That's a really important piece of this puzzle. And we're going to understand by the end of this video why getting at absolute truth is much more complicated than you might have even thought coming into this video. You might have had that thought, and this is going to confirm that, or you maybe never even thought about any of this stuff, and this is a brand new field for you to really start to explore. I'm going to give you a lot of references so you can go and do your own research. Again, I'm doing my best to be as historically accurate in what I'm undertaking, but I only know what I know and what I've been led to through my research. Have other information to bring into this conversation, please do that. I am open to always hearing other people's resources and what they're researching, because that's how we build that collective memory. But I think that you'll also see by the end of this video and the end of this series that it's so complicated, it's so difficult to get at any absolute truth. And there's a really, really huge benefit to that I think we can use for our evolution and for the benefit of our society. So let's jump in. So have you ever stopped to ask, how do we really know what happened in the past with 100% certainty? Or there was any writing of the past or videos like we have today? I have done a lot of that. And what I have understood from my study is that history is more of a mosaic of incomplete stories, documents, and interpretations, but none of these are time capsules. None of them are time machines, and none of them are perfect. They're just puzzle pieces, and a lot of times historians have huge pieces of the puzzle missing. So how do we arrive at what we have been taught? Well, we need some kind of a method to collect data from the past, understand if that data is reliable or not, then put it together in a certain way and be able to interpret it. This is called the historical method. Keep in mind, though, that a lot of times there's huge missing part and a lot more that we'll get into. Let me read to you what Wiki says about the historical method. Historical method is the collection of techniques and guidelines that historians use to research and write histories of the past. So again, they're not just taking the data and giving us the data. They're writing the story, filling in the pieces as best as they can to that story. Keep that in mind. Secondary sources, primary sources, and material evidence such as that derived from archaeology may all be drawn on. And the historian's skill lies in identifying these sources, evaluating their relative authority, and combining their testimony appropriately in order to construct an accurate and reliable picture of past events and environment. I think Wiki maybe is a little strong in that word. We know that Wiki can always not be 100% accurate in itself, and I'll prove that to you as we go along here. So again, the historical method, from what I can tell, can be broken down into three main steps. First, we need to be able to collect the data that will tell us about the past, if it's in existence, if we know about it yet. There's a lot of times where we construct a past and then we find more data that alters that past, such as the Nag Hammadi or Dead Sea Scrolls, which you'll hear me mention many times throughout this series or on this channel. And then within that first step, not only identifying those pieces, but also understanding the veracity, the truthfulness of those pieces that we can rely on, and the probability that those pieces actually were happening as they were. History really isn't about 100% accuracy as much as it is about the probability of something having happened in a certain way, we think. Number two, they recreate the past and tell us a story from that recreation. That is what gets in our history books and on YouTube channels nowadays. I do think we have a much more robust picture of some of the past, but as you'll learn later in this video, a lot of the past is always written by the people that could actually afford to write the past, or who were victorious and could dominate the narrative of the past. So keep that in mind. And then 3, we've already kind of talked about this, but the interpretation of these sources in context of the times that they were written in. So we talked about that in the last video, that writings have to be taken in context of the time, the language that was being used, the metaphors that were being used, the myths that were being used. All of that influences any particular piece of time and the people in that time to think in a certain way. So all of that has to be taken in context in order to create the hypothesis and establish the historical reason. Recapping, they have to find and identify pieces and then verify that they have veracity and probability of being accurate. They have to be able to recreate the past from those pieces, and then they have to interpret those pieces and write the story with as much accuracy as they believe they can within the context of understanding when and where these pieces were written. That is the historical method in a nutshell. I'm not sure if you can see some of the potential downfalls of that method and how incomplete it is. That is, in this 21st century, the best we have. I'm going to reiterate this again. All of this is only establishing probability of something having happened in the past, not 100% certainty of something happened in the past. Even in this modern age, we could have 500 different people filming an event that happened, and they would all be filming it from a different angle and a different bias. So what they're trying to capture might be different than the person next to them. We might not be able to fully pull together even what happened in the modern age. So how much more difficult is this to do out filming of the past that we do have today? But let's dive in a little bit deeper to understand how we can establish the probability of an event having occurred the way that it's written down. So here are some of the resources that source criticism, which is part of that historical method. If you go to the wiki page for historical method, you'll see this, have identified in order to come up with being able to ascertain the veracity and the probability of the accuracy of that document. Number 1, when was the source written or unwritten? Because maybe it was an eyewitness account, maybe it was an archaeological piece of evidence produced. What was the date of that piece of written or unwritten source? And another question that they would ask is, if we have multiple sources, what's our earliest dated resource that would be the closest to the date? All right, so date, very important. We also are asking, where was it produced? Where was the localization of that document? So if something was happening in the Middle East back in, Jesus's time, and there was a document produced over in Mazatlan in Mexico, we might not want to count that as a reliable source because people didn't travel those great distances back then. So we want to make sure that the piece is produced as close to the actual location of the event or the person living as possible. One of the other things we're looking for was an actual historical location. There's a lot of things like Atlantis, which we still have not proved, that aren't necessarily historical. We don't know that they exist with 100% veracity, with 100% accuracy. Number 3, by whom was it written? The authorship. So important. We're going to learn more about this later on, but you know where I'm going with this. I'm also going to talk about this at the end of the video, but is there a pseudonym? Was it written under a different name? Was it forged? There was a lot of forgery going on in the Middle East, where a lot of our history comes out of for the Western world. Number 4, from what or was there any pre-existing material that this piece was made from, essentially? Was it produced from another piece? Can we identify an earlier piece that infuses the information into the piece that we're looking at for our historical reference? And again, they're going to be also doing this whole test with that piece. How verifiable was that pre-existing piece? 5, in what original form was that piece produced? Was it stone tablets? Was it papyrus? Was it pieces of pottery, writing on the cave walls, newspaper, film, video, all of those things? They have to know what it was produced on in its earliest form and be able to, again, interpret the language and do all of those other things that we've already looked looked at for the first 4 steps in this process of verifying the probability of this resource. And last but not least, in the source criticism, from what I could find, the 6th step would be, what is the evidential value of its contents? Is it credible? That seems like another common sense question. Lastly, there's a few other questions I wanted to bring in here that were not listed in the wiki definition of this historical method and source criticism. I got these questions additionally from Bart Ehrman, who is a New Testament historical scholar that teaches at North Carolina at Duke. I just feel like these are also questions that we should have in the back of our minds. I'm going to put the little note in here that maybe you want to rewind and get those first 6 questions, add these 6 questions, and have them in your toolbox when you start to look at some history or even modern data, whatever it is, and asking these questions. I think these are really vital questions that we need to be asking ourselves. 2 more questions he asked are, there multiple independent resources that are attributing to this story? So again, these can be used specifically for the Bible is what he's using them for, but I do believe that they can be used for history as well at large. The second question he often asks, is the story counter to the agenda of the storyteller? So one of the examples he uses is that women go to the tomb first to see that Jesus is not there in the tomb. Therefore, that is something that would be counter to that context that we keep talking about in that day and age. So therefore, we can probably rely on that information have been somewhat probably true. There's a couple other valuations that he would use to make sure that that story is maybe true in order to say that it was historical. And there is a difference actually, and I'm going to throw this in here just to confuse us all, and we'll get more into this when we talk about myths, but just because a story is true doesn't mean it was actually historical. So keep that in mind. There's a lot of stuff to keep in mind in these next few videos, isn't there? So let's take another example. Julius Caesar's assassination. We have multiple sources that state that it happened, but they all were written by non-eyewitness accounts. Since all of these accounts are independent sources, they didn't seem to collaborate with each other, but they do verify each other's stories. We can assume with a lot of accuracy and probability that Julius Caesar was indeed assassinated. So hopefully that gives you a good example of how they use the resources in order to be able to prove the probability of an event happening. Even though with all of these checks and balances in place, and as I talked about it, you probably can see there might be some very big gaps in some of these checks and balances that we have that you can already identify that would lead to less probability versus a higher probability. This is important to remember about historians in general. This comes from Wiki again. Though historians agree on very general and basic principles, in practice, specific canons of historical proof are neither widely observed nor generally agreed upon among professional historians. So if people are spending their entire lives studying resources and still cannot agree with each other on how to interpret, or maybe even, let's back up, verify and then interpret these documents, how are we to really know the past and 100% accuracy and if it's true, right? Maybe it's true, again, in the story sense, but it's not historically accurate. And we're relying on these people to write our history books that we're learning in our schools. And I don't know about you, but I never walked into a history class in high school and learned any of this. I was never made aware or given a warning that what you're about to learn had this amount of probability of being true. This is how we got to this history. Maybe they do that in modern history classes. I do not recall this happening. I mean, I remember being bored off my, you know what, in history class. And now I find history completely fascinating because of all of the stuff I'm talking about. But anyways, besides the case, I never got a warning. Did you? I never got a warning that this is one way the past could have probably happened with those specific words. I was just told, remember these dates and facts, remember this interpretation because you're going to need it for the test. You're going to need it for your AP entrance exam. That's it. That's history. That's the facts, right? That is what we got coming out of school. But it's not 100% accurate. And there's probably other interpretations of the same data that we are never given in our history classes. And yet we take it as 100% factually true. Do you see where I'm going with all of this? I don't know about you, but watching that again and again and again as I was editing it, my blood starts to boil because we have been misled about what history is in our history books. facts from people that teach it. They don't share any of that information, as you just heard me say. Let's jump into our challenge today and watch this video from The Great Courses. It's a subscription you can get on Prime if you'd like, and it's in a course about the ancient four civilizations. So you have the Mesopotamia, the Egyptian, the Indus Valley, and one other that I'm totally spacing on. It's just blowing my mind that he can't even answer these questions. My challenge is to you is, can you answer the questions that he's bringing up here from his point of view based on watching these first 4 1/3 of the episode? Can you answer the question as to why we don't have answers for the things that he's saying we don't have answers for? Take a look. What do you think?
As we've seen, of the 4 great earliest civilizations, the culture of the Indus Valley was the very last to be discovered. And it remains by far the most mysterious and ill understood. It's the only one of these for which we cannot yet decipher the writing, and so many fundamental questions persist, even about basic aspects of what was once a flourishing culture. We know almost nothing about the political structure. We know almost nothing about the religious beliefs. There are questions which are intriguing. For example, in their art, there are very few images of warfare, and this has led some to suggest that maybe it was a typically peaceful society. There also don't seem to be any of the standard sorts of figures we see depicted in art, such as priests or kings. And that's kind of strange when compared to most other cultures of this era. Similarly, archaeologists haven't been able to clearly identify even any structures which they can firmly say was a palace or a temple, which are absolutely standard features of every other early civilization. There's little archaeological evidence for political or religious hierarchy, or even a centralized state. And without those sorts of institutions, it's hard for us to understand all the standardization and coordination and specialization that we see in these cities. How could they build such an extensive infrastructure if they didn't have a centralized government? Well, at least for now, those are questions which we simply don't know the answers to. And all we have to go on are those physical ruins and artifacts of what was once a vast and sophisticated culture. Historians sometimes don't like to admit ignorance, but at times, really the most accurate and honest history that one can write is to freely admit what we don't yet know.
Let me know what you think. I will maybe share, let's do that. I will share the answer to this challenge in next week's end of the episode. All right, so much love. Bye-bye. Toodaloo. Ciao, ciao.